In his raw, vulnerable, and powerful memoir, Peter Young provides an unflinching look at how cult leaders brainwash their followers and inflict them with condemnation, hatred, and paranoia. When Peter married Paige, the love of his life, he unwittingly married into a whole new world, one dominated by the family guru, the bizarre Uncle Robert. While trying to remain close to Paige and thus save his marriage, Peter was unwittingly sucked into the tiny cult of Uncle Robert's, where casinos are churches and Jews conspire to rule the world. But you never know you are in a cult. You only know you were in one. So for nearly 20 years, Peter allowed himself to be slowly brainwashed, missing the obvious signs he was in a cult, including the true meaning of the mysterious tiger dream. Ultimately, Peter found the true meaning of the tiger dream and discovered that, even though he needed to be rescued from the cult of Uncle Robert, he'd been saved all along by a loving and gracious God. Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger is one of those books you simply can't put down once you start reading. Hello listeners, I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and welcome to this week's mini-series with author Peter Young. Join us on this 3-part installment looking at Peter's recently published memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. Before we jump in, a huge hello, hi and welcome to newest patron and supporter of the show, Ruth. I am always taken by surprise when a new person signs up to the platform, and I am eternally grateful for all of the support that I receive on Patreon. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy your exclusive content. For early access to ad-free full-length episodes, you can visit patreon.com/thecultvault and support the show from as little as £1 a month, and also gain access to monthly deep dives into infamous cults, shout-outs, discount codes, promo codes, and Cult Vault swag and merchandise. Now, on to today's episode. You can find more about Peter's book in the episode description, as well as a link to purchase this incredible memoir. Here is Peter Young. So hello, Peter, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your experiences and your recently released memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
You bet. First of all, Casey, thanks for having me on. And it's a pleasure to meet everybody in your audience. I'm Peter Young. I live just outside of Bozeman, Montana. So it is about mid-March right now. It's covered with snow still. And I have 5 children. 3 of them still live with me at home. So I love being a single dad. And Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger is the second book that I have written. The first book was called The Blue Team. It's a novel about faith and basketball.
I hadn't really thought about there being a connection between sports and religion until I read your memoir, because you've had an entire career based around sports, but you've also had a life of being a faith-based individual as well.
Yeah, so the kind of the premise behind my book, The Blue Team, is that the athlete's greatest adversary, the guy that he really has to conquer, is not for the basketball player, the guy trying to block his shot, or for the American football player, the guy trying to tackle him, or in baseball, the guy that's trying to strike you out. But it's your own mind. We are our own worst enemy. And so I believe there's a lot of parallels between Christian theology when you can apply it to sports. And the idea being, again, that, if you, let's say, are nervous to shoot that free throw to win the game, well, it's not the opposing team that's making you miss, it's your own mind. And so I feel like, as a faith-based person, when I rely on something greater than myself, for me, it's Jesus Christ, to put my identity in, well, I want to win every game, but it's not the end of the world. It's not my identity. So it frees me up to play more loose and more relaxed. And what I love about all these sports analogies is it can be applied to the butcher, the baker, or the banker, right? Not just for sports. It's true for all of us.
I really love that. And I think that through doing this podcast, I've had a lot of exposure to toxic religious environments that perhaps wouldn't endorse or encourage individuals to be involved in things like basketball teams or ESPN. And I think it was really refreshing for me to recognize that there are individuals who can practice their faith and enjoy those things in life as well. And so that was a nice part of your memoir. And I think that it was good for me personally to recognize that not all individuals involved in Christianity are going to be steered away from things that they enjoy doing. So could you let the listeners know about your work with ESPN and how sports really has played such a significant part in your life?
Well, so I grew up in New Jersey and I was your typical gym rat. So I was the kid that was always in the gym. You know, when in the summer, when other kids went to the Jersey Shore and got a tan, I was still white and pasty white because I was in the gym all the time. And I had four older brothers. They all played basketball. My dad played college basketball. Two of my brothers played college basketball. So from a very early age, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to play basketball. I wanted to be the next Larry Bird. It wasn't anywhere near as good as that. So that really just kind of dominated my life. And then when I got done playing, I got into coaching. And after that, I got into sports broadcasting. So I just have always loved athletics. And I worked for ESPN a little bit. I didn't work many years for ESPN, but I called college football and basketball games for ESPN. But I worked a lot of years for a company called OLN, the Outdoor Life Network, which became Versus. Now they're NBC Sports. So I did the Tour of Italy bike race. I did an adventure race in Morocco. I did rodeo and sailing and rock climbing. I did everything.
What would you say is the most exciting or wild broadcast you've ever done for any sport? What would you say is the one that always comes to your mind when you think about like adrenaline and excitement?
Okay, that's a good question because again, I covered so many different events and I've done so many different things. And I've got listen, we all have really funny stories, right? But I could probably say the most exciting one is the Calgary Stampede. So maybe your audience knows that in Calgary, that's kind of the biggest rodeo, one of the biggest rodeos in North America. And so they have the rodeo during the day. So that would be bull riding and calf roping and steer wrestling and all that. And then at night, they have the chuck wagon races. So if you've ever seen the chuck wagon races, I think there's three or four teams, and each team, so you got a wagon, and then you have six horses attached to the wagon, and then you have outriders. So you've got like 24 some odd horses in the arena, and there's 25,000 fans there in the stadium. And where our perch was to be able to call the event, so we got our headphones on and we're watching this, they would come right beneath us. And it was like literally being able to watch and listen to a thunderstorm pass 20 feet away from you.
Wow.
And the crowd's going crazy. And then they would come back after the lap and they would finish the race right in front of me. And it was amazing to watch and be able to call those races. So much fun.
Oh my goodness. So you were one of those people that was like blah, 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 as the race goes round really
Yeah,
quickly.
yeah.
Oh my
You
goodness.
had you had to be able to think quick on your feet. Yes.
Like an auctioneer almost.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to jump ahead, Casey, I have to say this too, because we're going to kind of skip right ahead. But in my book, the cult leader is Uncle Robert, and Uncle Robert knew nothing about sports. Literally, he wouldn't know a basketball from a baseball. So the fact that over the years I made my living in sports, I love sports, I wrote about sports, uh, drove him nuts. He hated the fact that I would teach our children, disciplines and good sportsmanship and respect for authority, et cetera, all these wonderful life lessons that I would be teaching them through sports, but he didn't understand it. So he just kind of was very dismissive of it. It was one day where our oldest son at the time was a senior in high school. And, he was like, should he go play basketball? And he was not the greatest. He'd be on the team, but he wouldn't play much. So I was like, well, should he have him do it? And at the time, my wife and I, Paige, we were talking to him. And it was mostly Paige talking to Uncle Robert. And I kind of heard from a few feet away. She said to him, we're trying to teach him these life lessons about discipline. And he almost just spat out the words, you teach him. Like he was so dismissive of it because he didn't understand it and thus he couldn't control it.
And of course, wants to tell everybody that he knows everything that there is to know about everything.
Right.
So having another man, I imagine, present in his environment, having knowledge about stuff that he doesn't, I imagine that drove him crazy.
Yep. He did not like that. Yeah. And that came out later on, when I wrote my book, The Blue Team. So I wrote it before my wife at the time had left me. Things were already pretty bad at this time, and then I was kind of full on brainwashed. But I was still able to write the book and finish it, and thankfully not ruin it. I did go back a year or two later and kind of tweak it and try and pull out the influences of Uncle Robert. But after it came out, about let's say a year or two after it came out, he was so dismissive of it. And he said the only reason I wrote that book was to try and fool him and everyone else in the cult that I was a Christian. I was lying, and I was just going to try and fool them by writing this book. Unbelievable.
There's so many things to discuss around Uncle Robert's perception of Christianity. And I don't really even know
Where to start.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we can go back to the beginning of this particular part of your life and allow the listeners some insight into your earlier experiences, which you detail so well in your memoir. It's so brilliantly written. I think you might be able to tell that this isn't the first thing you've published, because it's so well done. But
Thank you.
what I was able to understand pretty quickly from the opening of your book is that the experiences detailed in the memoir are not about a group that you were born and raised in, but rather a group that you were introduced to a bit later in life. So could you set the scene for the listeners and tell them a little bit about what your life was like in your childhood growing up before you were introduced to Uncle Robert?
Sure. So let me just kind of start. At 28 is when I met Paige. And again, that's not her real name, but we'll just go with that for right now. So that's when I met her. So, and I had lived a pretty good life up until that point. I was born in New Jersey, the youngest of 5 boys, wonderful Christian parents. We grew up in a small little church there in town, and had friends. My mother, who hails from Scotland, all the Scots from her side of the family settled in New Jersey. So we had all of these aunts and uncles and cousins, and we'd get together once or twice a year. So we had a large family. And then we had a large church following. And then I went to a public school, went to college, got a degree, played basketball, fairly normal, healthy life, I think you would say at that point. And then I moved to Idaho, which is way out west, so a long way away from New Jersey, and got my first full-time job in TV. So I was the sportscaster at the 6 and 10 o'clock news. And that's where I met Paige. Now, Paige's history was also fascinating because Uncle Robert met Paige's father, John, at a tiny seminary. I don't even know if it exists, in Fresno, California. So they would have met even before Paige was born, in, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s. So in other words, Paige's whole life, Uncle Robert, who's not related. So Paige and her family are from Vancouver, British Columbia. And Uncle Robert is this guy from Syria. Don't look anything like him. Paige and her family, they're all tall, very Nordic looking. Uncle Robert's got, olive complexion, black hair, he's short. But anyway, Paige's father, John, was a man that was probably ripe for somebody like Uncle Robert to come in and kind of just dominate his life, which is what he did. So from the seminary on, Uncle Robert was always there. He lived in Southern California. Paige and her parents lived in either interior BC or Idaho. But he would come and visit every now and then. Paige's parents would always talk to him on the phone. So again, Paige grew up, if she ever had a question, and by the way, questions that you would normally as a woman ask your mom or another woman, she would ask Uncle Robert these questions. I mean, very sensitive topics that a young woman should not be talking to another man about, unless it's her husband. But Uncle Robert was always the go-to guy. So, if there was a question that Paige's parents couldn't answer, call Uncle Robert. So then when we met in Idaho in 1996, again, I was 28. I remember, try and set the scene. I'm a tall guy, I'm 6'5", but Paige was 6 foot with the most beautiful head of hair, long golden curls, and just a stunningly beautiful woman. So I remember being, again, single at 28 at the time, I would see her around town and I would tell my friends, oh, that's the blonde girl. That's the blonde girl. And so there was a guy at the gym named Gary. And I'm telling Gary, I don't even know her name. I'm like, this blonde girl. And Gary's like, oh, I know who that is. Gary knew who she was. And he says, well, that's Paige and her sister. That's, Rebecca. And, but be careful, because he could tell I liked her. They've got this weird family guru. And I remember before I ever even met Paige, my future wife, I knew about Uncle Robert. He was the family guru. So then when I met her, like at a singles Bible study, right? I go to a singles Bible study, I turn the corner to go into the room, and there she is, the blonde gal. Before I even had met her, I knew who Uncle Robert was. I didn't know his name, but I knew about the family guru. And that's how it started.
Who does not give off Christian vibes. It's not a word that I would associate with Christianity. Is that am I wrong in that conception?
Well, here's what as I go back and I look back and ponder everything, again, hindsight's not always 2020, but it can be. And so I believe that the Lord has given me wisdom. I asked for it, he's given it to me. So I've been able to kind of go through all this and process it, and he's given me the eyes to see. That is that, Uncle Robert, when we got together and we'd have these conferences, he would just sit and listen to him talk for hours and hours and hours. But he would read from the Bible, right? So, it's not like he's, teaching us anything that's satanic or anything. He would read from the Bible. But the analogy I give is, okay, you hit a golf ball. Now, again, Uncle Robert was teeing up the right thing. He's reading from the Bible, so he's teeing up the right golf ball. But if you hit a golf ball this much, 100 yards down the fairway, it's going to be 100 feet to the left or 100 feet to the right. Well, he would put his spin on everything. And 5-10 years down the road, you're so far away from the gospel. You're like, how did we get here? You read the Bible, then you got the gospel of Uncle Robert with all of his sayings, and they kind of sound good, but they're not biblical. And even if you had a very limited knowledge of the Bible, you would say, wait a minute, this is not healthy. This is wrong. But, I would say I was all in, literally brainwashed for 2.5, 3 years. It took a long time. I went along to get along. So when people ask, well, how did this happen? I said, well, my wife adored the guy, revered him, and I loved my wife, and I wanted to get along, and I wanted to have a happy marriage. And so I knew it pretty early on, he's not going away. So I got to find out a way to get along with this guy, or else I'm not going to have a close relationship with my wife. So that's how I just kept, getting sucked in further and further.
I was enthralled in those first chapters of the book where you were talking about this beautiful woman and you were all shy and you didn't know how to approach her and you felt a certain way when you would see her because I think all of us have a little bit of that romantic inside of us and will he get the girl, won't he get the girl? So I was really really invested in those early chapters, and I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through those initial conversations that you were able to have with Paige.
Sure. Well, it's an amazing love story. Really, it is. It's a wonderful love story. I had dated girls in the past. I'd never been married or engaged or anything, but I had a couple long-term relationships. And so I, knew what it felt like to be in love. I'd been in love before. I knew what it felt like to date somebody. But I would say after about 10 days, maybe, I was 90% sure I wanted to marry this woman. I was absolutely in love with her. She was different than any other woman I'd ever met. And I remember before I went to Idaho to get this job, to start this new job, I prayed. I said, Lord, could you, in 2 years, because I had a 2-year contract, give me this wonderful job working on outdoor sports and be married to this beautiful, tall, blonde Christian woman. Well, check. It checked all the boxes. And so you might be asking, well, what was the other 10%? What was your hesitation in terms of wanting to marry Paige? And it was, I needed to meet her father and Uncle Robert because she talked about them all the time. So I knew if I marry this woman, these two people are going to be a large part of my life. So then I met Paige. It was in late October, and I just fell in love right away. And met her parents at Thanksgiving, so like month later. And her mother's very quiet. Her father, meant well, had a good heart. Odd. It was an odd first meeting, but I thought, well, this is okay. This will be fine.
It was an odd first meeting. I've just remembered the part of the book that made it a kind of a bit odd with that he told
Yes.
you that you can't stand up to use the toilet.
Yeah. Yeah. So picture this again. I'm just meeting these people, and I'm kind of auditioning for the son-in-law, right? And I love this woman, and I'm there, and I've probably only been there like an hour, and I'm a little nervous. So I go down to the hall and I use the hall bathroom, and as soon as I open the door, he's right there, standing in the hallway. And his hearing wasn't the greatest because he was a contractor, so always using power tools. So he stood really close. He said, "Yeah, in our household, the men sit down to pee." And then, okay, that's weird. But what really made it weird was Uncle Robert taught us that. And that's the first time I heard that phrase. And I couldn't tell you how many times I heard that over the next 20 years. Why are we doing this? Because Uncle Robert taught us.
You meet Paige's parents and things continue to go well, but there's always that sort of thing in the background of Uncle Robert. He's like, even though you don't initially meet him, he's always there. He's just always there.
Because she's always bringing him up. Now, when of course, one of the pivotal moments of this whole entire story, kind of the magic key that unlocks this mystery and why I named the book "Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger," really is right off the bat. So I'll go ahead and tell your listeners briefly. I'm 6'5" to start. Uncle Robert's about 5'6", so he's a very short man. About a month before I met Paige, she had never met me. She had a dream. Does the Lord speak to us in dreams? I don't know. He's God. I guess he can do it if he wants. But anyway, it was a very important dream to Paige. And in the dream, she's in a house and there's a tiger that is on the loose. And she knows that if the tiger finds her, it's going to kill her. And she's in the house with a boyfriend at the time named Chad, and then her mother. And then the door opens and in comes a tall man. And the tall man is there to get rid of the tiger, but she can't see the face of the tall man. So the dream really bothered her. So she sent a letter to Uncle Robert, and then Uncle Robert sent this 23-page letter back to Paige. He wrote it, I think, on like a Wednesday, and I met her on Sunday. And I know all this because Paige kept the original letter and the envelope with the postmark. So I went back and looked up what days were these. So he wrote the letter Wednesday, sent it Friday. I met Paige Sunday for the first time, 1996. So I know all of this happened before Paige met me. So it wasn't until 20 years later, and I'm like, well, duh, she couldn't see the face of the tall man because she hadn't met me yet. And she described the tiger with all of these descriptions that would accurately describe how she felt about Uncle Robert. The tiger was very strong and knowledgeable and powerful, and et cetera, et cetera. And she didn't want to kill the tiger, only wanted to kind of know where it was. And then when the tall man enters the dream, comes to the front door, she hides, Paige does, and Chad, the boyfriend, disappears. So when Paige shows up to that Bible study the first time, she's alone. The next week she shows up, and I'm counting the minutes till the Bible study the next week. She shows up with Chad, the boyfriend. That's the last time either one of us ever saw the guy. So just like in the dream, in real life, when Chad met me at that singles Bible study, never saw him again. At the time, I didn't know that would be significant. But again, 20 years later, after Paige had left me and I found the original letter and read it over again, my jaw hit the floor. And so I read this letter. Paige had me read it. It was so important to her. She had me read it about a month after we met. And I'm like, okay, it's odd, strange. But she was so invested in it. And I wanted to support her. And I said, okay. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, wait, I'm tall and this guy's short. Why? And in the letter, Uncle Robert tried to claim the position of the tall man, tried to claim he was the tall man. And most importantly, in the letter, he convinced Paige she wasn't a Christian. So she believed him and thus became one of the first people that had to be saved again by Uncle Robert, because eventually we all were. So yeah, he was always in the background, always.
The other strange thing about Uncle Robert is that he doesn't live in the immediate
Right.
vicinity, and there's not like a traditional congregation or church house that you're going to on a regular basis, it's almost like he doesn't really have his own group of church goers. It's Paige and her family, and then him and his family.
And that leads to one of the questions, Casey, that I would get all the time after I got out of it and was rescued, and people, and I would explain this to them. Again, they were just trying to grasp all this because it is a crazy story. And they'd say, well, what about other people? Were there, the Swansons, the Andersons, the Smiths, the Jones? And I'd say, no, there really wasn't. Did he have a congregation? Not that I know of. He never had a job that I know of. So he had a couple buddies. That one guy was, brother Michael, who was kind of always there. And Michael, I don't really know if he had a job or not. But other than that, no, it was us. So Paige and her parents, one brother, and then me and my children, this guy Michael, and maybe another guy or two, but that's it. And and Paige had a very large family. She had aunts and uncles and cousins, and then she had 4 siblings. She was one of 5 as well. And they got all shunned, every one of them, except for the one brother. All of them, all because of Uncle Robert.
In your initial stages of your relationship with Paige, you meet her, she has a boyfriend, but you notice that they're not really physically intimate.
Right.
They talk, but they don't seem like emotionally connected, maybe. And then eventually Paige comes and she's not with Chad. So you
Right.
see your chance and you take it
Right.
and you start dating and you quickly fall in love, and it's so romantic and just wonderful and lovely to read. And then you meet the parents and that kind of goes, pretty much okay. How long is it then before you are officially introduced to Uncle Robert?
Okay, so yeah, Paige and I meet in late October. I meet her parents in Thanksgiving, late November, and I don't meet Uncle Robert until Paige's older brother gets married in April. That's about mid-April, and she caught the whatever, I caught the garter, and I mean, everybody kind of knew that we were going to have another wedding here pretty soon. But there was a key moment in between. So again, I meet Paige in October. I don't meet Uncle Robert till April. In February, Paige flew up to Northern Idaho to do something for work. She stayed at her parents' house, and Uncle Robert was there. She had been disturbed by this letter, the dream letter about the tiger, this whole time. And so while there with Uncle Robert, he convinces her, yeah, that tiger is you. The tiger is you, Paige. You are not surrendered or saved. You are going to kill yourself, metaphorically speaking. You are not saved. You are not a Christian. And she had already been baptized. She'd already professed her faith. She didn't need this guy to do this to her, but he convinced her. So then she came back. Like, I remember that vividly. She came back that day, and we were at my apartment, and she was all aglow, so excited. And yeah, I was just saved by Uncle Robert. Okay, it sounded odd, but I didn't want to say anything. And then I could just tell by the way she was looking at me. I said, "You don't think I'm saved either, do you?" And she said, "No." And I still hadn't even met Uncle Robert yet. And I remember at the time being disappointed, but I just knew she and I were destined to be with each other. And I thought, well, I can't go convince you, Casey. I'm a Christian, and you better believe me. That's silly. Nobody can do that. You show it by how you live your life. And so I thought, that's what I'll do. And apparently I did. And so then I met Uncle Robert at Paige's older brother's wedding in April. Again, odd, eccentric. I thought, I didn't spend a whole lot of one-on-one time with him. So I thought, okay, I'm fine. And then I knew, like, on the plane ride home, I'm ready to ask her to marry me.
Do you know anything about Uncle Robert at this time? Who is he? Where did he come from? Like
Right.
it's so strange, and it's it's detailed in your writing so well how you were slowly brought into Uncle Robert's sphere of influence over time, and how your
Mhm.
mindset changed, not from your own volition, of course, but
Right.
through the coercion that you were placed under. It's so strange trying to piece together. the earlier parts, the 60s and
Mhm.
70s, and Paige's father being caught in Uncle Robert's sphere of influence, because you're falling in love with a woman who is directly involved with him and has
Mhm.
been since she was born. So I understand that part of you moving into that space. But the other part of it is just it's strange, isn't it?
It is, again, so much of it I didn't see, right? I didn't meet Paige until, in 1996. She's in her mid 20s or early 20s. So I didn't know all of this background. So there's a couple moments that I can remember that were really telling, especially now, 25 years later. First one, Paige and I were there in Pocatello, Idaho, and I don't think I'd even met Uncle Robert yet. It might have been right before going to her brother's wedding. She was always talking about him, and I had said something to her about along the lines of, it's really kind of odd the way you and your sister talk about him. And Paige said, how can you say that? She was very delicate because she loved me as well, I think, at the time. But she was trying to delicately say, well, how could you say that about him because you've never met him? And then I said to her, I said, Paige, I'm not saying this about him. I'm saying this about you. It's not him, it's how you talk about him. I don't know anything about the guy. I don't remember her reaction, but it was she and her sister at the time. And of course, the irony is that in a few years, her sister came to understand who Robert was and despise him. And then at our wedding, Paige's real uncle, who actually unfortunately just passed away, he was in his late 70s. He just passed away about a month ago. But he did marry us, the real uncles. This is John's brother. And he said something along the lines of, Peter, over the years, us Clausens haven't gotten together much like this. This is kind of a rarity. And it was because John had really isolated his family away from everybody because of Uncle Robert. John's relationship with his parents, so this is Paige's grandparents, were always strained for decades because of Uncle Robert. So my kids represent the one, two, three, fourth generation that has been affected by this guy. So my kids' great grandparents, their grandparents, and obviously their parents, and them. And so we got married and we initially moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I used to live. And then a year later, we moved back to Idaho. But Uncle Robert lived in Southern California. So for those first few years, it was heaven on earth. I mean, we didn't see him much. And I didn't, he didn't really control my thoughts, or he probably did with Paige because she'd be talking to him on the phone a lot, probably more than I knew. But it wasn't really until our second, it was two moments that really kind of put gasoline on the fire. It would be the birth of my second son and 9/11. So can I just go into those two stories?
Yeah, please do. I really loved hearing about the well, there are a lot of stories about the your children entering the world, and each of them are so like different in
Yeah.
their own way as well. And I really enjoyed getting the insight into those experiences. As somebody that has two young children myself, I do appreciate a good birth story. So there were some interesting points in the book regarding that as well. So please do tell us. You got married and you did go on
Yep.
to have
Yep.
children.
Yep. Yeah. So we got married. And then, of course, 10 months later, whoa, this is what happens. We had our first son. And then about, let's say, 2 years later, we got pregnant again. And I had been on a sports broadcasting assignment. I think it was in Boston. And I flew in and I would always, come home to Pocatello. We lived just south of Pocatello. And I, get in like on the red eye and I'd get home at about midnight. And Paige, is pregnant. She kind of rolls her belly over and says she's leaking. And again, having never grown up with a sister, and my mother never talked about this kind of stuff. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? She was leaking amniotic fluid. So we went straight to the hospital. And they determined that, sure enough, she did have a leak. She was 26 weeks pregnant. So she had to stay on bed rest for the next 6 weeks. Our son David was born 32 weeks. So he's 8 weeks premature by C-section. Obviously, his lungs were severely underdeveloped. So he was in the ICU for about, he was in the ICU for 6 weeks, nearly died several occasions. So it was very difficult. I was at home with our oldest son while she was in the hospital. And so it's scary. And then immediately upon coming to the hospital, the doctors don't know why these things happen, right? They don't know why women start leaking amniotic fluid early, or why things happen with pregnancies. They do happen. But Paige knew. So what Paige came to believe was, just prior to this episode of going to the hospital, her sister Rebecca had said to Paige and her parents, listen, I don't think this Uncle Robert guy is who he says he is. I think he's a fraud. I think he's dangerous. I don't trust him. Just be careful. And that was it. She didn't say, well, Paige had kind of accused Rebecca later on of saying certain things, but that's all Rebecca said. I don't trust the guy. I think he's bad for our family. I don't want anything to do with him. And I don't know if I even put this in the book, but at that moment, her mother was convinced, you're right. And then the father, I think, was partially convinced and was going to go over to confront Uncle Robert at that guy George's house. And the mother and the father, so my former in-laws, at that moment, after having talked with Rebecca, were like, yeah, you're right. And then, as soon as Uncle Robert, got John one-on-one, flipped the switch. So John was like, oh, my daughter's wrong. My daughter's wicked. And then Rebecca shows up to the house where there's all these adults, and she's this young, emotional girl. And that was it. So she gets viciously shunned by the family. But in conversations, Paige had believed Rebecca and said, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we need to be careful. And she supported her sister for a brief amount of time. And then she goes to the hospital. And so she became convinced, Paige did, that the Lord was punishing her and basically threatening the life of our child, going to kill our son in the womb, because she did not stand up for Uncle Robert when Rebecca, her younger sister, defamed her. I remember, at the time, I thought, really? Because she told me this a few days after being in the hospital. She was in anguish and tears. She'd already talked to Uncle Robert on the phone, and he, of course, probably agreed with her.
That's it, isn't it? That's where the idea of that has come from. I was going to ask if they were in communication while she was in the hospital. So that answers that question, doesn't it? How did she arrive at that conclusion? Well, quite obviously from his
on the phone, always on the phone with him. And so then she told me, and again, I thought, really? That seems kind of odd. Okay. And she was clearly in anguish in a difficult moment. I didn't want to challenge her on it. At the time, I'm still kind of like, who is this guy? I mean, really? And you're going to treat your sister this way? So then that was when the family split. So, we did not see any of the aunts and uncles anymore. I still haven't seen the aunts and uncles and cousins since 2020. Haven't seen any of them. And then 3 of the siblings, all gone, all shunned. And then Lincoln was thankfully born, tiny little kiddo. He was over 4 pounds, so bigger than we thought. But I'll never forget when he was born. It's a difficult moment because your wife's there, and there's a sheet, so she can't see what's going on behind the sheet. So your wife is not in 2 pieces, but doesn't look good. She's on the table. And so your son comes out, and I went with him, and I had to leave my wife in the operating room. So then I follow into the ICU, and they put him on like this, almost looks like a little warming pad, basically. And he was struggling to breathe, and he's got the tiny little body, and his chest cavity and abdomen would literally go about that small, and then up on the breath. And that small. And so I'm right there, on my knees, talking to him. And tough moment, but Lord saved him, got him through it. And so then he got out of the hospital a couple weeks later, and he ended up being a Division I college athlete. He's now 6'5", a stud. But boy, it was scary. What a fascinating and scary start to his life.
And you're tall as well, so I imagine that your hands are quite big. And do you remember the first time holding him and how small he was to hold?
Because our first son and all the other children were very big babies, and he's. My hands aren't that big, and I've got a kind of bent finger there, but he's fitting right in there. He's pretty small.
Oh gosh.
So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, and for me, I thought, well, this is a bonding moment between Paige and I, between my wife and I, where we can draw closer together. I didn't realize the magnitude of the influence Uncle Robert had on her in that moment. I read a letter she wrote. Literally, I found it on my computer or like on a CD. 18 years later, I never read it. And it was what Paige revealed to be her thoughts on that whole moment, and how she wrote how she was sinking into the abyss of death and hell, and she was giving up her life because she had not defended Uncle Robert. And the Lord was literally going to turn her back on her and kick her to the curb and send her to the pit of hell because she had not defended Uncle Robert. And again, at the time, I didn't know this. So what I thought was, we're going to get through this moment and we're going to be a team. And again, at the time, I thought I was the greatest husband on earth, the greatest father, and we had the greatest marriage, right? Little did I know that behind the scenes, it was unraveling, even at that point, and I didn't know it.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on Stop the Tiger, Save the Tall Man. For more on Peter Young and his writing, you can follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.